There are many different animals you can find in this rocky intertidal habitat. If we look closely, we will find crabs, snails, kelp, and a wide diversity of other organisms. The number of different species that we find in a habitat, like this rocky shore, is one measure of what we call biodiversity. Let me tell you more about biodiversity and how we measure it. We use the term biodiversity to describe the variety of organisms found in an ecosystem. There are several ways to quantify biodiversity, but the most commonly used definitions relate to how many different species we find in a given ecosystem, as well as how many individuals of each species are present. There are a number of reasons why we want to keep track of biodiversity. For example, to measure ecosystem health. When biodiversity of an ecosystem starts to decrease, it is usually a sign that the ecosystem may be in trouble. The two ways we measure species biodiversity are to record what we call species richness and species evenness. Species richness measures how many different species there are in an area, while species evenness measures how many organisms there are of each species. Both of these habitats have the same number of species, or species richness. The sea star, crab, and snail represent 3 different species. However, the species evenness is greater on the habitat on the left. In the example on the left, the 3 different species have around the same number of organisms. In contrast, in the example on the right, while the same total number of species are present, the number of individuals are dominated by crabs. This poses a problem for the crabs because there are not enough snails or other prey species to support them, which means this ecosystem probably is unstable. Scientists use a variety of tools to measure biodiversity, in our case species richness and species evenness. One tool is a quadrat. Here's a quadrat or sampling square that is 0.25 by 0.25 meters. Quadrats allow for a standard area to be studied, regardless of how big the overall habitat is. So for example, we can compare biodiversity in small or large tide pools. Counting the organisms and species within the quadrat is one way to measure biodiversity. All the organisms that lie within the quadrat are considered in this biodiversity measurement. This includes all the different plants and animals that are touching the border of the quadrats. Field guides can help identify the different species that are seen. Quadrats can also be used to measure the percent cover of algae in an area. For example, if plants like algae where recognizing individual organisms may be difficult. Percent cover is the area in the quadrat that is filled by a species. Imagine that the quadrat has 100 tiny squares. If a species of algae covers around 25 squares, this would be 25% cover. The most one species can fill is 100%, but some areas will have more than one species living on top of each other. Because of this, total percent cover can add up to more than 100%. Biodiversity is a biotic measurement that measures the living factors in an ecosystem. By counting the organisms that are there and seeing if this changes over time, scientists can keep track of ecosystem health. The most biologically diverse ecosystems are called biodiversity hotspots and are of concern because if they are damaged or destroyed, we may see a large number of species go extinct. This is especially true in habitats that are home to species found nowhere else on Earth, something we call endemism. Today, many ecosystems are at risk of collapse, but in many cases we still don't have a good idea of what their biodiversity levels are, so we may not even be aware of what we are losing.